Welcome to the webinar Diversity Business Certifications at the local, state, and federal level. We are excited that you're joining us tonight. This webinar is brought to you by the Boston Local Development Corporation, BLDC, and the Transactional Law Clinics, at Harvard Law School, TLC. I'm going to now pass the floor to Bill Nickerson, who will introduce himself and speak more about BLDC. Bill?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Hopefully it'll be a very informational couple of hours for everybody, or hour and a half for everybody. Just a few words about our Small Business Loan Fund, the Boston Local Development Corporation. BLDC is, we make, in simple terms, we make small business loans. The BLDC is actually a 501c3 corporation overseen by a group of trustees that are a very great group. Many have been on the board for many years, bankers, attorneys, community development people, a very informed and diverse group of people that guides our outreach and our investment into all sorts of businesses. As this focus of the rest of this webinar is on certifications, we work with many small businesses that have these various certifications, and they're really important. Again, it's 501c that makes small business loans. Gisela and I work for the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and we staff the program and manage the program. However, it is truly a true 501c3 that holds the money that the loans come from, and that board are the loan deciders, if you will. If I was still a banker, they'd be my senior credit committee. We've, in the last 20 years, we've provided over $20 million in small business loans. And we are very proud of the fact that we work well with other lenders, especially Boston's banking community and other nonprofits that do lending like this. And we've leveraged at least $95 million through that $20 million. So that multiplier effect is very important. The purpose of the 501c3 is specifically to create or retain jobs in the city of Boston. And to that end, we've retained and created probably well over, but we use a number of 3,500 jobs that have been created through the loans we've made. Next slide, please. This purpose of this slide is just to show what we're looking for when we take a loan application. As you can see, we're pretty much asking for the same things that a bank's going to ask somebody. You do have to be a City of Boston business for us. Now, if there's anybody on here who's not from the City of Boston, or their business isn't going to be, well, come move to Boston. But if you're not going to, feel free to get in touch with us. We have other partner organizations we work with that don't have the same limited demographic as our program. Our program is specifically for the City of Boston. Again, as you can see, standard 3 years tax returns, 3 years projections, balance sheets, etc. If somebody falls into the realm of industrial manufacturing, we can lend up to $250,000, and for other businesses up to $150,000. And again, the focus is on job creation and retention. Next slide, please. Although the focus is on job creation and retention, we were very proud to see we received a grant. We're given a grant that we had applied for under the CARES Act from the federal government. And again, I say the focus is job creation, retention. However, when we lent out those funds, it turned out that we were able to loan 80% of the total dollars to BIPOC-owned businesses. And we were very proud of that fact. Here's a picture of a couple of our borrowers that we work with, Cilantro Latin Kitchen. Hector opened his first place over 25 years ago on Blue Hill Ave when it was a very pioneering move. We opened Merengue. This is his 4th restaurant to Roxbury Crossing. Marvelous Cuts is a really cool barber shop. This young gentleman had a place in Brockton. He wanted to open a Boston location. We were able to finance that, and he's down in the financial district now. Next slide, please. This is just flat out us blowing our own horn. We gave this woman a loan at the beginning of COVID to finish her expansion into her new hair salon. And she was so successful that she paid us off well ahead of time. And when she did, she sent this note to us with the support about the support we gave her. And we just loved hearing it so much, we decided that we want to share it with other people. Next slide, please. This is another of our recent borrowers, a little Cocoa Bean. And here's somebody else who, you know, gave us an awful nice statement to us after she had closed her loan. It's a fascinating place. It's having its grand opening in December in Jamaica Plain. And she sells healthy baby food that's very ethnically, culturally connected to her own background as her family is a Afro-Panamanian background. So the things that, as she said, she saw growing up, she's putting into the baby food. And it's also got a lot of other odds and ends and tools and things around raising your baby. It's all surrounded as a brand. It's really ingenious, but it's also a lot of fun. And she's a very impressive young woman. Next slide, please. I'll pass this over now to Gisela.
Thank you, Bill.
Take it from here.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to take a moment to provide a few words in Spanish about our business loan program. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Gisela Soriano y trabajo para la organización Boston Local Development Corporation. El propósito de nuestra organización es ofrecer préstamos para pequeños negocios localizados en la ciudad de Boston. Aquí en este gráfico, como pueden ver, les ofrezco más información. Acá a la mano derecha, nuestros préstamos pueden llegar hasta la cantidad de $250,000 para aquellos negocios en los sectores industriales y hasta $150,000 para negocios en otros sectores. Si usted es dueño o dueña de su negocio y está buscando capital, sería un placer ayudarlo o ayudarla. Para ser elegible, su negocio puede ser nuevo o tener varios años operando. En el chat voy a escribir la dirección de nuestra página web para que obtengan más información sobre nuestros préstamos e información de cómo aplicar. Si tienen alguna pregunta durante la presentación, por favor, escríbanlo en la sección Q&A, localizada en la parte de abajo en su pantalla. También al final de este taller vamos a tomar preguntas, ya sea en inglés o en español. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros esta noche. Back to English. Here is our contact information. If you are a Boston business owner and need a funding or looking to open a new business in Boston, Bill and I would welcome the opportunity to help you. In the chat, I will provide our website link for more information about our business loan and application criteria. And now, if you have any questions during the presentation, which will get started momentarily, please type them in the Q&A in the bottom of your screen. Here's a picture of what it looks like. At the end of the presentation, I will read out loud the questions. Actually, my colleagues at TLC will read out loud these questions that have been written in the Q&A. And after the questions in the Q&A are written and answered, we will also open up the floor for live questions through verbal asking, through sound, if you will. Please do not type in, please do not type in the chat because it gets a little bit messy. We want to make sure that all questions are typed in the Q&A. If you cannot find the Q&A, please send me a message through the chat. That would be the only time, and I'll give you more information, but it should say Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my pleasure, let me just close my presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our partners at the Transactional Law Clinics at Harvard Law School. We have several amazing folks here tonight. I will send it over to Josh Payne.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about diverse business certification. We'll be going over a lot of information, but as mentioned earlier, these slides and recording will be available after the presentation. We'll be doing about a 50-minute introduction on all the information, and then we'll stop the recording for a 20 to 30-minute live question and answer section. We want to quickly go ahead and introduce who will be speaking to you today. So my name is Joshua Payne. I'm a second year here at Harvard Law School, and I'll specifically be covering state certification. We're also joined here by Patricia and Carmen, who are clinical instructors throughout the program. And I'll go ahead and pass it to Tolu.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tolu. I am also a second year at Harvard Law School, and I am a student attorney at the Transactional Law Clinic. I will be covering the federal certifications this evening. And we have one more, Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Kelleher. I am also a second year at Harvard Law School in the Transactional Law Clinic, and I will be talking about the Boston certifications.
Awesome. So to continue with the introduction, like we said, we're part of the Harvard Law School Transactional Law Clinic. The Transactional Law Clinic consists of the business and nonprofit clinic, the real estate clinic, the entertainment law clinic, and the community enterprise project. These clinics provide legal service to small businesses, entrepreneurs, and community organizers for business formation, contract review and negotiation, community economic development, licensing, and other transactional legal services. In every respect, the Transaction Law Clinic operates as a professional law office in the service of clients. The clinic is run by clinical instructors who are licensed practicing attorneys that supervise us Harvard Law School students participating in the clinic. As a general disclaimer, this presentation is for informational and educational purposes. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship between the Harvard Transactional Law Clinic and the businesses participating in this webinar. We'll be covering race, ethnicity, and demographics as defined by the different government statutes and regulations. So to get started, we wanted to look at what is a diverse business certification. So certifications allow the party you are hoping to work with officially recognize your business as minority-owned. Common types would be minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, disability-owned, and LGBT-owned. And there's different certifications that are available at all three levels of government. So as you can imagine, Boston certifications pertain to entities that want to conduct business with Boston specifically, while state and federal certifications have broader reaches. A big distinction that we want to differentiate up front is the difference between public and private certifications. Private certifications are granted through third-party organizations that allow businesses to bid in the corporate arena. Some of these private certifications can also be used to satisfy the qualifications for state and federal government certifications that will allow for bidding and contracting in the public arena. And these public certifications, these will be the focus of our presentation. These are certifications administered by Boston, Massachusetts, and the federal government for the purpose of bidding and contracting with the government. Some demographics may only qualify for private certifications, others might only qualify for public, and many might qualify for both. So there's many overlaps that can be confusing, but the main takeaway is that private certifications will allow for contracting with independent companies, while the public certifications, which we will focus on, are for working with the government. So there are some advantages and difficulties that come with these certifications. So starting with the advantages, the first one would be more work opportunities. Minority business benefit as they get preferred access to these government grants and contracts. The government has a vast amount of work that needs to be done, in which your business will now be a priority. You also have increased amount of access. Many state governments and large corporations make it a policy to do a certain amount of work with disadvantaged businesses. So now they'll reach out to you. You also have training and workshops available. Certifications provide minority businesses access to training, workshops, and mentorship possibilities that can accelerate your learning and development. These can help include guiding you into better obtaining these government contracts. Lastly, you have networking opportunities. There's strengths in numbers, and there is a lot minority businesses can learn from one another. A great feature is that they provide various network opportunities for certified businesses to share best practices and support each other. Some of the difficulties that one might face with these certifications is that the process is cumbersome, it requires many documents, and it's not the most straightforward. So hopefully through this informational webinar, we're able to dispel some of these difficulties. Here on this slide, you can see the graphic. It's a large overview of all the certifications we will cover in this presentation. Although we don't have time to go into each one in depth, you should use this as a reference guide to see which certification you qualify for and or are interested in. We will specifically be covering, as you can see through the categories, women, minorities, veterans, LGBTQ individuals, disabled persons, and small businesses, all at the Boston, state, and federal levels. Now I'll pass it over to Tolu to start us off with the women-owned certifications.
Great, thank you, Josh. First, we'll begin our presentation by covering these 4 different women's business certifications. The first is the Federal's Women-Owned Small Business and the Economically Disadvantaged Women-Owned Small Business Programs, followed by Massachusetts Women Business Enterprise and Boston's Women Business Enterprise. Before we dive in, we want to emphasize that although we are focusing on women's certification first, many of these factors we'll discuss now will apply to subsequent certifications. Thus, for brevity's sake, we will spend more time on explaining the women-owned certification details, and in subsequent categories, we'll focus more on referencing the definitions we discuss now and pointing out the similarities and differences. So please pay extra attention at this point as we cover this category, even if it's not necessarily relevant for you. So before we get started, I want to discuss 2 key points that are specifically important for federal certification. As Josh mentioned, the federal government in this case sets out to award a general amount of federal contracts each year to certain categories. The administrative body that manages this process is the U.S. Small Business Administration, or the SBA for short. Essentially, the SBA maintains a list of eligible industries and their North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes. This table lists small business size standards and matches it to industries already described in the NAICS. The size standards are generally expressed in either millions of dollars or number of employees, as you can see in the chart on the screen. And the size standard is just the largest that a business can be and still qualify for as a small business for federal government programs. For the most part, size standards are either average annual receipts or the average employment of a firm. So in this instance, we can see for on the top row, new car dealer should have either at maximum 200 employees or less to qualify as a small business, whereas the row below that for used car dealers, they should have around $28 million or less in average annual receipts in order to qualify as a small business. However, businesses who may not have an NAICS code or who choose not to participate in SBA's federal contracting program may continue to identify as, for instance, a women-owned small business for the purposes of competing for other contracts. However, they will not be eligible to pursue federal contracts restricted for SBA certified women-owned small businesses and or economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses, for example. So in light of this requirement, please note that across all federal certifications, a business must meet the SBA's definition of a small business and have a corresponding NAICS code to apply for the federal programs that we're going to be focusing on today. Great. So first, we'll cover the Women-Owned Small Business Federal Contracting Program, which was created to help provide a level playing field for women business owners and allow these businesses to compete for programs set aside contracts within eligible industries. So in order to qualify for the Women-Owned Small Business Program, you must satisfy the following requirements. First, for individual eligibility, you must be a United States citizen. Your citizenship can be verified either by a state-issued birth certificate or certificate of naturalization or an unexpired passport. You must also be a woman. The SBA does not provide detailed guidance on who qualifies as a woman, but the gender in any of these prior documentation can be used to prove you are a woman. Next, we have ownership. And so the person or persons, in this case, women, would need to own at least 51% of the business, both unconditionally and directly. Unconditional and direct ownership is a requirement that's going to come up time and time again as I go through the federal certification process. So it's one that's important to understand. To put it simply, unconditional ownership merely means that the ownership cannot be subject to any conditions that could potentially cause their ownership and ownership benefits to be transferred to another party or entity. Whereas direct ownership means that the person directly owns the business and they don't indirectly own it through another business or entity. So if a woman owns a business that's principally owned by another business entity, then that arrangement would not satisfy this requirement. And next we have control. And control is another important definition that can seem a bit vague. Essentially, the person or persons, women in this case, must manage the daily business operations and be in charge of long-term decision-making. Additionally, a woman must also hold the highest officer position in the business, for instance, a CEO, and they must have the necessary managerial experience for such a role. And the woman doesn't necessarily have to have the technical expertise or possess the required license to necessary to control the business. She just needs to demonstrate that she has ultimate managerial control over those who possess the required license or technical expertise. And there is also an accompanying limitation on outside employments because the woman must manage the business on a full-time basis and during normal working hours. As I mentioned, these definitions will come up time and time again. And since this is supposed to be a recording, you can refer back to it at a later point if you're confused. And we'll reference these definitions in later slides. So if you need to familiarize yourself with these definitions, you'll have access to that information. Next, we have economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. There are additional contracting opportunities if a woman-owned small business is actually owned by an economically disadvantaged woman, which we'll cover in this slide. So in addition to satisfying the women-owned small business requirements that we just laid out, which were being a US citizen, being a woman, unconditional and direct ownership over the business, and management control, there are a few additional economic requirements for this certification. First, each owner cannot have personal assets greater than $6 million, so it must be $6 million or less. They cannot have a personal net worth greater than $750,000, and their adjusted gross income average over the previous 3 years cannot exceed $350,000. And then on a more personal front, the woman must also be socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged. And you should also pay attention to these two new definitions as well, because they're also going to be relevant for future slides. So first, for socially disadvantaged individuals, they're individuals that have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias within American society because of their identities as members of groups and without regard to their individual qualities. The social disadvantage must stem from circumstances that are beyond their control. And these groups are largely predetermined by the SBA and include the groups that you see on the screen here, which include Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, subcontinent Asian Americans, and additional members of the other groups that the SBA can determine from time to time. This means that if you're not a member of these aforementioned groups, you can still establish individual social disadvantage status by satisfying the following criteria of having one objective distinguishing features that have contributed to your social disadvantage, either race, ethnic origin, gender, physical handicap, etc. The social disadvantage must be rooted in treatment that you've experienced in American society, but not other countries, not necessarily other countries, I mean. And then it must be chronic and substantial, not fleeting or insignificant. And it also must have negatively impacted your ability and entrance in advancing in the business world. Next, we have economically disadvantaged individuals, which are socially disadvantaged individuals who have experienced difficulties establishing their business due to their inability to access capital and credit opportunities at the same rate as others in the same business, but who are not also socially disadvantaged. So economic disadvantage will be evaluated through examining one's personal financial information. Next, we'll be transitioning over to Josh.
Thanks, Tolu. So now we're going to talk about the state certification for women. And kind of as Tolu mentioned, so there's 5 requirements that are all required for the certification. And the only one that changes throughout the certifications is the individual eligibility. So I'll go through all 5 in depth right now. So even if you're not a woman, still pay attention because requirements 2 through 5 will apply for your specific certification. For women specifically, the certification that's available at the state level is the Women Business Enterprise through the Massachusetts Supplier Diversity Office. So for the first requirement, and this is the requirement that will change per certification, is the individual eligibility. So here, the eligibility is that you have to be a US citizen or permanent US resident, and you have to be a woman, and your status would be shown through a copy of a birth certificate, driver's license, or passport. Requirement number 2 through 5, as mentioned earlier, these will be required for all the certifications. So requirement number 2 is ownership. A person must own at least 51% of the business entity. And this ownership must be real and substantial in both form and substance. So you must go beyond the paper ownership. You can show so through your federal business or personal tax returns. If your company is less than a year old, then you can just provide a current balance sheet or opening bank statement. And so it must be 51% or higher under the same certification category. For example, if you're a woman who owns a business 50-50 with the male veteran, you would not qualify for a women-owned business or the veteran-owned business because you did not pass the 51% threshold. However, if you're a woman who owns a business and at 50-50 with another woman who's also a veteran, then you would qualify for the women-owned certification because you can add up within the same category since the business would be 100% owned by women. However, you would still not qualify for the veteran-owned business. As a quick side note, a Delaware corporation can still apply for this state certification, but you must have a principal place of business in Massachusetts. You can also apply for as many certifications as you qualify for. For example, if you're a Black woman, you can apply for both the women-owned certification and the minority-owned certification. Moving on to requirement number 3, control. So this means you must be involved in the revenue generating aspect of the business. You must show that you have control over the firm's governing body and you're truly leading the business. Requirement number 4 is that you must show that you're an ongoing business. So you can't start the business just to get the certification. If you restructure your business that allows access to the certification less than 12 months prior to applying, the Supplier Diversity Office will assume you did this solely to qualify for the certification. One way to show that you have active proof of revenue stream or that it will begin soon is through your marketing materials. So if you're less than a year old, you can submit these marketing materials and we'll go further into details what those are later on when we talk about the required documents. And the last requirement is independence. You can't rely on ineligible persons, so in this case, non-women, for major aspects of the business. You need to have the capacity to perform the work of your business. These requirements are dense and have more nuanced examples, but the purpose is to make sure the businesses applying for the certification accurately reflect the target audience for state government contracting, which in this case is women. And I'll go ahead and pass it on to Katie.
Thanks, Josh. So next we're going to talk about Boston's women-owned business certification. So the Boston certification actually has the same name as the Massachusetts certification. It's the Women Business Enterprise, or WBE. But it's important to note that these are 2 separate certifications and have 2 separate application processes that, again, we'll talk about later. The requirements for the Women's Business Enterprise certification in Boston are very similar to the requirements that Josh just explained for the Massachusetts certification. It essentially requires that the business is 51% women-owned, that ownership is beneficial ownership, that women have control over management, that the business is an independent business, and that the purpose of the firm was not to take advantage of this program. So similar to how Tolu explained earlier, the definition of beneficial ownership here means that the business is both legally and actually owned by the business as opposed to something like a trust. And to verify this, the city confirms the name on the business certificate and the articles of incorporation and or tax returns. The independent business requirement requires that the business is not in a substantially dependent relationship with a non-women owned business. And they would also look at whether the business shares a business address with a non-women owned business that engages in substantially similar business activities. Control over management is demonstrated by the duties that the owner has in the business, and this includes day-to-day activities and finances of the business and the roles of other owners. And lastly, the firm cannot have been established solely to take advantage of this program, and the city verifies this by reviewing past contracts and upcoming contracts, business associations, and in some cases will also interview the owner. Similar to how Josh and Tolu have explained as well, you can apply and qualify for more than one certification. So many women-owned businesses can qualify for all of the different certifications that we just discussed at the state, federal, and Boston level. This slide just shows basically what I just explained, the definitions of each of these requirements. And so because this is going to be recorded, you can come back and look at this slide at a later time. And next, I will pass it over to Tolu to talk about the minority certifications.
Great, thanks again, Katie. For minority certification, we have two federal programs, the Small Disadvantaged Business and the 8A Business Development Project. For Massachusetts and Boston, they both have a minority business enterprise certification. So as I just mentioned, from the federal side, the Small Disadvantaged Business certification is a separate federal certification process specifically for minority-owned business. To qualify for the Small Disadvantaged Business, a business owner must meet 3 requirements. First, in terms of individual eligibility, the individual must be a U.S. citizen. Second, they must also be a disadvantaged person. We previously just discussed under the economically disadvantaged women-owned small business slide what constitutes a disadvantaged person, which includes both being socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged. So if you have any questions, feel free to respond, feel free to go back to that slide or that part of the recording. Next, in terms of ownership, once more, the disadvantaged person must unconditionally and directly own the business. And lastly, a disadvantaged person must manage and control the daily business operations of the business. As we also discussed, hold the highest position of the business, be employed full-time, have the managerial experience necessary to manage the business, and so on and so forth. Next, we have the 8A Business Development Project. Section 8A of the Small Business Act authorized the SBA to establish this program, which is known as the 8A Business Development Program, hence the name. The 8A program is a one-time robust program created to help firms owned and controlled by socially and economic disadvantaged individuals. Some of the benefits of the 8A program includes efficiently competing and receiving set aside and sole source contracts, receiving one-on-one business development assistance on helping your business grow and accomplish their business objectives, pursuing opportunities for mentorship from experienced and technically capable firms, and even receiving free training from SBA's Management and Technical Assistance Program. 8A certification lasts for a maximum of 9 years. The first 4 years are considered a development stage, and the last 5 years are considered a transitional stage. Continuation of the program is dependent on staying in compliance with the requirements. And lastly, please note that if you're a current participant of the 8A Business Development Program, you automatically qualify as a small disadvantaged business certification program as well. So first, in terms of individual eligibility, this is a one-time program, so a candidate cannot have previously participated in it. Additionally, they must be a U.S. citizen. They must also be a disadvantaged person, which we've discussed previously. In terms of ownership, the disadvantaged person must unconditionally and directly own at least 51% of the business. The disadvantaged person must also control and manage the daily business operations of the business. And fourth, this is a new standard, the good character standard, which is a bit vague, but speaks generally to possible adverse circumstances that may impact whether or not the individual may qualify for the program. So for example, whether or not the individual has a prior criminal history, any pending lawsuits, recent bankruptcy, insolvency, outstanding financial obligations or liens, whether the individual has been barred or suspended by any federal entity, whether or not there's evidence that the individual knowingly submitted false information in the 8A Business Development Program application itself. If you have any particular questions about whether or not about your particular circumstances, you can contact the 8A Business Development Certifying Body to discuss your concerns. If anything may arise after you submit and that may implicate the good character requirement, then the certifying body may request additional documentation such as court records or explanations for any incidences. Next, we have the potential for success, which is basically your business must demonstrate this potential, which is usually done by being in business for at least 2 years. They'll normally examine records such as like your taxes, revenues, any commercial loans, and the licenses that you have. Next, I'll pass it over to Josh.
Thank you. And so now the minority application for Massachusetts, it's specifically called the Minority Business Enterprise and also through the Supplier Diversity Office. And so all, like mentioned earlier, the 4 requirements, ownership, control, ongoing business, and independence are all the same as mentioned earlier for the state. The only thing that's changed here is the individual eligibility. Under the Code of Massachusetts regulation, the state defines a minority as Indian or Indigenous person, Asian, Black or African American, or Hispanic. In Massachusetts, Portuguese-owned businesses are not considered minority-owned businesses. These individuals will only be included in the definition of minority if specifically set forth in programs funded by state, transportation, bond statutes, or other statutory authority, which include these individuals as eligible participants. Portuguese applicants are a separate certification category from the minority business enterprise, and that certification is called the Portuguese Business Enterprise, also through the Supplier Diversity Office. And I'll pass it to Katie.
Thanks, Josh. So the Boston Minority Business Enterprise certification, again, shares the same name with the Massachusetts certification, but it is a different certification. For this, it has the same requirements as the Women Business Enterprise, as I previously explained, except for the only difference is the eligibility requirement. So again, very similar to the Massachusetts certification. The definition here is of a minority group member instead of being of a woman. And so the definition of a minority group member is a US citizen or permanent resident that is Black, Cape Verdean, Native American, Hispanic or Latino, or Asian, including people who have origins in any of the original peoples of the subcontinent of India. The city relies on self-identification for this. And again, just like we've been explaining, you can qualify for more than one certification. So many minority-owned businesses will qualify for both the Boston and the Massachusetts certification and at the federal level as well. Next, we're going to talk about veteran-owned businesses, and I'll pass it over to Tolu.
Great, thanks, Katie. As we can see on this chart, there are two federal certification opportunities. First, the Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, and second, the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program. For the state, there are two state certifications, the Veteran Business Enterprise and the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Business Enterprise. And lastly, for Boston, it also has its Veteran-Owned Small Business certification process. So looking at the federal process, so unlike the other federal certification process, both the Veteran-Owned Small Business and the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business certification process is currently handled by the VA's Center for Verification and Evaluation, or the CVE. Once verified through the CVE, businesses can compete for VA set-aside contracts. Please note that unlike in prior categories, these contracting opportunities are awarded through the VA and not the federal government. However, recently, as required by the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, the CVE certification process will actually be transferred to the SBA effective January 1st, 2023. One of the primary motivations for this transfer was to streamline the process of the federal small business certification programs. Following this transfer, the VA will still continue to determine veterans and service-disabled veteran statuses and maintain these records. Additionally, the SBA will continue to rely on the VA for providing that information, and VA contracting officers will be using the SBA's database to confirm a business's eligibility when awarding the SD-VOSB or VOSB contracts. Please note that if you are certified under this current program, at the time of the transfer, you will not actually lose your status under the new system. So first, we'll go through the individual eligibility. First, the individual has to be a US citizen. Next, the individual must also be a veteran. According to the VA, a veteran is a person who served on active duty with the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard for any length of time and was discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. To verify veteran status, the CVE generally requests the applicant to provide official documentation from the military, such as an individual's DD-214 form. Next, we have ownership. So at least 51% of the business must be unconditionally and directly owned by one or more veterans. Next, control. The veteran owner must make the long-term decisions and manage the day-to-day operations of the business. Next, we have good character. The good character requirement is examined on a case-by-case basis. And the definition of good character for this program is similar to the good character requirement for the 8A program, which we walked through. And lastly, the individual must be registered in the System for Reward Management, which is a U.S. government portal for businesses, organizations, and federal agencies to win government contracts. Next, we're now moving to the Service Disabled Veteran Owned Small Business Certification, which closely mirrors the Veterans Owned Small Business Certification, though there are a few key differences. So for individual eligibility, the individual must also be a U.S. citizen. The veteran must be a service disabled veteran or their surviving spouse if the service disabled veteran has passed. According to the VA, a service disabled veteran is a veteran who possesses either a disability rating letter issued by the VA establishing a service-connected rating between 0 and 100%, or a disability determination from the Department of Defense. Third, the individual must have a service-connected disability. The term service-connected means with respect to disability or death, that such disability was incurred or aggravated, or that the death resulted from a disability incurred or aggravated in the line of duty in the active military, naval, air, or space service. Disability would typically have to be permanent and severe. And please note that some mental disabilities can apply, but not all. So if you have any questions about your particular case, you can check in with the VA to find out additional details. Next, in terms of ownership, one or more service disabled veterans must have at least 51% unconditional and direct ownership. At least one or more service disabled veteran, or in the case of if the veteran is with permanent and severe disability, the spouse or permanent caregiver of such a veteran must also exercise control over the business. Lastly, the service disabled veteran must demonstrate good character, and they must also be registered in the System for Reward Management. Now I will pass it over to Josh.
Thanks, Tolu. So now moving on to the state. So for the state, there are 2 applications available. The first one is a Veteran Business Enterprise through the Massachusetts Supplier Diversity Office. And like mentioned earlier, the requirements are the same. The only difference is eligibility. And so you qualify as a veteran if you can provide a DD 214 form from the Defense Department. So that's one of the documents that will be required if you go through this application. The second certification available is the Service Disabled Veteran Owned Business Enterprise, and that's available as a recognized certification. So a recognized certification is not a separate Massachusetts state certification. Rather, you apply for the certification through the third party. In this case, it would be the federal government. And if they approve you, then you submit that approved certification to the Massachusetts Supplier Diversity Office, and the state will automatically recognize the certification as valid. So essentially, the state will accept the completed certification at the federal level. So here, as Tolu just mentioned, for this certification, you would apply, just as Tolu mentioned, through the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. And I can pass that on to Katie.
Thanks, Josh. So next we'll talk about Boston's veteran-owned businesses. So Boston doesn't have a separate certification for veteran-owned businesses specifically, but what it will do is it will recognize the federal certification so long as the business qualifies for one of the other Boston certifications. So just as a reminder, the 2 certifications that we've already talked about for Boston were the Women Business Enterprise and the Minority Business Enterprise. There's also 2 others, which we will talk about in a little bit, that are the Small Business Enterprise and Small Local Business Enterprise. And so for veteran-owned businesses in Boston, if you qualify for one of those 4 other certifications, you can also qualify to be recognized as a veteran-owned business as well. And to do that, you would just provide your certification letter from the federal government. And next, we will talk about LGBTQ businesses, and I'll pass it back to Josh.
Thanks, Katie. So here on the next slide, we'll see that the certification available is the LGBT Business Enterprise, also as a recognized organization. So just as I mentioned with the Service Disabled Veteran Business Enterprise, this one's a recognized organization, but this is recognized through a private third party. So here you'd use the link on the screen and you go through this application through the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, which is a private third party organization. So when you complete this application, if approved, then you can just take that completed application and apply to the state and they will automatically recognize it. Next, we'll talk about the disability-owned business enterprise through at the state level. So similar to the one just mentioned, this is also a recognized certification through a third party. So likewise, you go to this link here, apply to Disability IN, which was formerly called the U.S. Business Leadership Network. It's a national nonprofit that helps businesses drive performance by leveraging disability inclusion in the workplace. And here, through this third party, they define disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And with that, I can go ahead and pass it back to Katie.
Thanks, Josh. So next I'm going to talk about two certifications that Boston offers. There are two additional certifications in addition to the ones that we've already discussed, and they're called the Small Business Enterprise and the Small Local Business Enterprise. So we'll start with the Small Business Enterprise. This type of business has two requirements. It must be small and it must be independent. And so the way that the city of Boston determines whether a business is small is it actually looks at the federal SBA standards that Tolu talked about at the very beginning, and it calculates 75% of that amount. So you'll see here on the right, I have a screenshot from the SBA standards for construction businesses. If you look at roofing contractors, the SBA size standard is 16.5 million. So to qualify as small for Boston certification, you have to be 75% or less of that, which would be 12.375 million. And so that's how you qualify to be a small business. And it, again, depends on which category you fall into for the SBA standards. The other requirement is that the business must be independent. And so this is the same independence requirement as the earlier Boston certifications. And what it means is that the business is not substantially dependent on another business that does not qualify for this certification. And so again, it cannot share the same business location as a non-qualifying business that does substantially similar business activities. And next, we're going to talk about small local business enterprise. And so for Boston small local business enterprise, the only difference between this and the small business enterprise is that it has to qualify as a city firm. And so city firm means that basically the company is in Boston in some way. And so you'll see here on the right, I've explained based on the different types of business business entities that you could be, what that would mean for qualifying as being a city firm. So if we look at a corporation, you can qualify as a city firm if the majority of your shareholders are residents of Boston, or the principal place of business of the corporation is in Boston, or a majority of the employees are residents of Boston. And so it's interesting because there's different options and you just have to qualify for one because it's an or. And so in order to qualify again for this certification, you have to meet the same standards as the small business enterprise plus the city firm requirement. And next, I will pass it over to Tolu to talk about the hub zone.
Great, thanks, Katie. As Katie just mentioned, there is an additional federal certification process called the hub zone. We'll be going into that now. Next slide, please. Thank you. This program aims to fuel small business growth in historically underutilized business zones, or hub zones for short, hence the name. Joining the hub zone program makes your business eligible to compete for the program set aside contracts. It also gives you preferential consideration in the full and open competition of these contracts. As you can see on the slide, this is a screenshot of the interactive hub zone map available on the SBA website. This map will change as time goes on, but currently you can plug in your address where it says enter address above to see whether or not your business or residential address is located within a hub zone. Now to cover the general specific requirements to join the hub zone program. In terms of individual eligibility, this is a bit different from the other federal categories we've discussed. So here, the owner or owners should either be a US citizen, but it could also be a community development corporation, an agriculture co-op, an Alaska Native corporation, a Native Hawaiian organization, or an Indian tribe. The ownership and control requirements are similar to previous categories where the qualifying person or entity must unconditionally and directly own the business, and they must also manage the day-to-day operations and make long-term decisions. The principal office of the business must actually be located within a hub zone. So once you have the residential address or the business address, you would go into that hub zone map, enter it in, and confirm that it's actually contained within the hub zone. And in terms of employees, at least 35% of the employees must actually be living within a hub zone. Next, we are transitioning into the actual application process for these different certifying levels. I will walk through the federal application process, Josh will walk through the Massachusetts application process, and lastly, Katie will walk us through the Boston application process. So despite the numerous federal certification programs available, there is a generalized certification process when it comes time to finally apply. There are some important differences that I will point out. And additionally, please recognize, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that the VOSB/the CDVOSB process is separate and handled largely through the Center for Verification and Evaluation. So as I discussed in the beginning of this presentation, you must first identify your NAICS code in the SBA Small Business Standards table. Next, for point 2, you should also review and prepare the required documentation for your respective certification or certifications, because this process can be, the documentation for this can be a bit unwieldy, and so it's important to work on that as soon as possible, so you can quickly move through the process once you begin it. Third, you must register on the System for Award Management, or SAM. And please note that if you are applying for the small disadvantaged business, you would actually apply for certification in step 3 and not step 4 like all the other programs will actually do. And so in step 4, there are 3 separate portals that applicants must access if they want to apply to these 3 programs listed here. So for the women-owned small business and economically disadvantaged women-owned small business applicants, you would first create an SBA account at login.gov, and then you would apply for certification at beta.certify.sba.gov. For the 8A program, you would actually apply through the certify.sba.gov portal. And lastly, for the Hub Zone program, you would apply at the general login system. Once we distribute the PowerPoint, you can actually access the login information through the hyperlinks in the presentation if you want an easy way to find it. And next, for step 5, you would actually submit the required documentation you reviewed and prepared in step 2. And then for step 6, you should also regularly check your emails after you submitted your application, even your spam folders, in case someone from these certifying entities reaches out to you to request additional information or documentation for your application. The processing time does vary across the different programs, so just be mindful, like the timing of that can vary across them. Next, we're looking at just general required documentation that you must provide across the different certifying entities. Since U.S. citizenship is required for the federal programs, you must either provide a state-issued birth certificate, certification of naturalization, or an unexpired passport. Next, you must generally provide professional or technical documentation, such as your resume, letter of explanations if necessary, and any technical licenses if they're applicable. And lastly, you must provide general information about the business itself, such as the highest office owner, information on other firm owners and current board members listed in the bylaws, and so on. And next, we're looking at entity-specific required documentation. So we can see a list for like corporations, LLC, partnerships, sole proprietorship. There could be additional documentation you have to submit. For as we can see in corporations, you would need your articles of incorporation, any kind of meeting minutes for your board, corporate bylaws, and so on. LLCs, you would have your operating agreements, articles of organization, and so on and so forth for the partnership and sole proprietorship. And then we also have additional program-specific documentation. So for the economically disadvantaged women-owned small business program, they require personal tax returns, business tax returns, since it focuses primarily on economically disadvantaged individuals. Whereas if you compare that with the Hub Zone, for instance, it requires documentation that verifies the firm's location, employees' addresses, since the program is focused on revitalizing specific underutilized business zones. Next, we're looking at the current VOSB/SD-VOSB application process. Once again, this is a bit of a pivot because it's a separate process, but it will also change starting January 1st. But if you choose to be certified on this process, once again, it'll automatically transfer to the new system. And so the process that I'm about to walk through is likely to change in 2023. So similar to the SBA process we just walked through, before you start this process, you should most likely review and prepare the required documentation because it can be a bit extensive. And once you have your documentations in order, then you can begin the process. So first, you would register in the System for Award Management. Once again, it's a portal for business, organization, and federal agencies to win government contracts. Next, you must create a DS or ID.me account in order to then create a vendor information page account in the next step. If you're a veteran, you must create a DS log on at the link above. However, if you're a non-veteran representative, then you would actually go through the ID.me logon account process. For step 3, following the creation of either the DS or ID.me account, you would then use it to create a vendor information page account. Next, for step 4, you would apply for certification through the VIP. In step 5, you would upload the required documentation to the VIP system. And step 6, you'll submit your completed application to the CVE and check your emails regularly for any updates or additional requirements that they may request from you. And then after your business is certified, then your business's profile will be visible on the VIP database. Additionally, there's a list of required documentation that you'll need to gather specifically to apply for these programs. There are general similarities between this documentation required here and the documentation is required for the SBA process, such as like the articles of incorporations, bylaws for corporations, and articles of organization, operating agreements for LLCs. It's important to remember that to verify the veteran status, the CVE generally requires, once again, like I mentioned, that you provide some form of official documentation from the military, such as the DD-214 form. Additionally, if you're applying for the SD-VOSB, then you would need the disability rating letter issued from the VA that establishes the service connected rating. And lastly, I just wanted to quickly walk through additional federal resources. I've just covered a ton of information, and much of which may be confusing. However, as I mentioned, you will have access to the recording of this presentation and a copy of the slides, so you actually have direct access to the links that we're referencing. Here in the slides, I've listed several free resources that can also provide helpful details about the federal programs that we discussed today. They can provide additional guidance, offer step-by-step guides, and even some helpful videos that help walk you through the process. If you have any further questions, you can also contact the listed offices there, and some departments even have office hours for you to call in at specific times with your follow-up questions. And with that, I'll pass it on to Josh.
Thanks, Tolu. Now I'll quickly walk through the Massachusetts application process and their required documents. So starting with the overview of the process. So you're going to have the application, and then it's going to go to a 30 to 60-day review process, and then a 15 to 30-day approval and reporting process. So to dive into each one of those a little bit more, for the application, it starts with the mandatory pre-application online workshop. That's a 2-hour webinar that is offered once a month, and after you complete it, it's valid for a year, and this is required. Then you're going to apply through the online platform, which I will show you on the next slide. And then it'll go through an intake review. And this is where your uploaded documents are either accepted or rejected. And if they're rejected, you'll be notified and have 30 days to resubmit the correct documents. After the application stage, you move on to the review stage. You'll be notified when your application has been assigned to an investigator to determine whether you meet the requirements for that specific certification. They could request additional documentation at any time during the review, in which you'll have 10 days to respond to the request. So it's very important you stay on top of your email as well as your junk mail. Then you'll go through a site visit or telephone interview based upon the nature of your business, and they'll work to set up a date and time for that. Lastly, the approval and reporting process. So the investigator will create a detailed summary report and reasonings for whether you should be accepted or denied. And then this report will be sent to a certificate committee. And then this committee will actually be the one to make the final decision. If accepted, your certification will be valid for 3 years. A renewal notification will be sent 30 days before expiration of these 3 years. And if you fail to respond in the 30 days, then you'll have to reapply through this whole process. And lastly, the appeal. If denied, you'll have 10 days from the date of the denial letter to appeal the denial. There will be instructions with the denial letter on how to appeal. Next, we'll talk about where to apply. So if you go to the website linked here and search Supplier Diversity Office, and if you scroll down to the certification program for SDO, this is the screen. This is a screenshot of what you'll see. So first, if you look at the top, you'll see the self-assessment. This is good, just introductory to make sure it's a quick 2-minute questionnaire to make sure you know what you do qualify for if you still have questions after this. And it's only an online application through this specific supplier diversity portal. And the instructions here will actually be sent to you after you complete the webinar on how to apply. So you must complete the webinar first to even apply. Unless you're applying through one of the recognized organizations mentioned earlier, then you can see the link there at the bottom left to apply directly. And next, I'll talk about the required documents. So here's just a reference guide. You can come back and look at all the required documents. These are required for all the state certifications. A few that I want to point out, the vehicle registration and the business space documentation are only applicable if you have a vehicle or physical business space. And then in terms of the marketing materials I mentioned earlier, so you need to produce marketing materials or 3 customer invoices to show that you're an actual business that has generated revenue or will in the near future. And so what typically qualifies for marketing materials are customer bids, grant proposals, websites, contracts, or other things that can show customers being reached now or in the near future. And then on the right, you'll see different documents required depending on how your business is structured. And I can go ahead and pass it on to Katie.
Thanks, Josh. So I'll quickly run through the Boston application requirements and process. So just for a high-level overview, you can apply either online or you can apply by mail or email. Also, as you'll see later on in the slides, once your business is certified, businesses will be located in the Boston Certified Business Directory database. And also something else that I just want to point out here is that there are weekly office hours offered by the Supplier Diversity Program in Boston. And so they have a virtual meeting every Wednesday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And I've also placed the link here in the slide for how to access that virtual meeting as well. So to apply online for Boston, I'm not going to go through the whole process because there's actually this really useful video, which I've provided the link for here. And it's just on the website. So you can watch that video. I won't duplicate all the information here, but essentially you'll just need to create an account on their portal and then fill out all the details. But if you are the kind of person who likes to print things out and send things by mail, you can also just print out the PDF of the application, which I've again linked here. So you can print this out, fill it out by hand and send it in the mail, or you can also use this PDF and send it in by email as well. And again, once you apply and are certified, your business will be located in this certified business directory here. So because this is going to be recorded, you can come back and pause the screen here to see all the different required documents that are required for the Boston certification. It overlaps significantly with the other certifications that we've already gone through, so I won't describe in great detail here. The only things that I want to point out are that the top row is required for all certifications. The middle row depends on the business type that you are, and then the bottom row depends on the certification. So like I mentioned before, for veteran-owned businesses in Boston, you'll have to provide that veteran-owned certification from the federal government, for example. Okay, next we're going to get some crowd participation here. We're going to jump into a fun poll question, which we're going to walk through a hypothetical situation, and we're going to ask you all to respond to the poll question of what certifications you think this business qualifies for. Okay, So the business that we have here, you are a Hispanic woman who owns a roofing business with your two brothers who are also Hispanic. The business is a Massachusetts corporation. You all own the business equally. You're the only shareholders and the only employees. Your two brothers are both former veterans. One of your brothers sustained a service-related injury that led him to be honorably discharged from the military. Your business brings in about $300,000 per year. You live in Cambridge and your two brothers live in South Boston. Your only assets are your 1/3 of the business. You're excited that you just secured a lease for your main office, which will be located in the north end of Boston. Okay, so there's multiple right answers here. So once Gisela pops open the polling question, you can select as many as are correct. You can also move around this pop-up that just appeared on your screen, so you can drag it to the side if you want to look at the presentation more. I'll also give you 2 quick hints. So the first hint is that I have a screenshot here of the hub zone map, and only areas that are shaded in blue are considered the hub zone. And my second hint is that the SBA limit for roofing contractors is $16 million per year. Okay, so I'm going to give you all 1 minute to answer this question, which I will start the timer now. All right, you have 30 seconds remaining. Seconds left.
This stuff is.
All right, 3, 2, 1, done. Okay, so great job, everyone. We've got a lot of great answers here. Thank you all for your participation in the poll. Yeah, so as you can see, they probably qualify for a lot of different ones, but they definitely don't qualify for all of them. So as you can see here, these are the right answers. So I'll just quickly walk through each of them. So just so that you're all aware, because the business is not more than 51% owned by a woman, it does not qualify for the Women Business Enterprise or the Women-Owned Small Business certifications. If you remember from earlier, it has to be 51% or more owned to qualify for most of these categories. The business does qualify for minority business enterprise at both the state and Boston level because it is more than 51% owned by persons of a minority background. It does qualify for the veteran-owned small business because it has more than 51% ownership by veterans, but it doesn't qualify for the service disabled veteran-owned small business one because only one of the 3 owners has a service-related injury. So I'll go to the next couple of them. So yes, it does qualify for the small business enterprise and the small local business enterprise for Boston. If you see my hint over there on the right for the SBA limits, it's well below that limit for qualifying as small, and it is considered a local business because the majority of the shareholders and the employees live in Boston. It also qualifies for the small disadvantaged business and the 8A business development project, again, because it's below that SBA limit. And lastly, it does not qualify for a hub zone because its principal place of business is in the north end, which if you can see on this map here is not shaded in blue. So it is not a hub zone. Thank you all for your participation in that. That was really great. So next, we're just going to quickly talk through some key takeaways and helpful tips before we jump into the Q&A. So across all levels, just make sure you start getting your business documentation in order. We went through a lot of the different required documents. Come back and watch this recording afterwards to make sure that you have everything that you need. That is going to be the biggest hurdle and is going to be the most cumbersome. So make sure that you start getting that prepared now. A couple of tips at each entity level. So for the federal level, make sure that you maximize the use of free assistance services and consider ways that you can get cross-certified. At the Massachusetts level, don't forget to attend the pre-certification workshop. And after you apply, make sure that you check your email frequently. And at the Boston level, make sure that you check out the Boston portal video. It's really helpful to talk through the process for applying online if you want to apply online. And again, Boston does have those weekly office hours that you can attend if you have additional questions about the process.